Tonight, you will once again step into the quiet world of Detective Blackwood, a world where the smallest detail can unravel something far greater than it seems. Some cases announce themselves loudly. They arrive with chaos, with urgency, with bodies and witnesses. And then there are others, the silent ones, the kind that sit undisturbed in archives for years, buried beneath dust, forgotten ink, and records no one thinks to question. This case did not begin with a crime scene, nor with a report. It began with a name that appeared every single day, always in the same place, always on the same train. And yet, no one had ever seen the man who carried it. At first, it was dismissed as an error, a clerical mistake, a duplication in the system. But errors do not repeat themselves with perfect consistency. Not for days, not for months, and certainly not for over 20 years. Because according to the records, this man had been traveling the same route every day for 2 decades without ever arriving. The station stood at the edge of the city, in that quiet zone where movement still existed, but attention did not. It was not abandoned, nor was it particularly busy. It simply existed in a state of routine, where trains arrived, passengers stepped out, and the world continued without interruption or memory. Places like this rarely held stories worth telling. And yet, this one did. I remember the first time Blackwood mentioned it to me. At the time, it sounded like nothing more than a minor irregularity, the kind that would normally be resolved with a brief explanation and a signature at the bottom of a form. There had been no urgency in his voice, no indication that what he had found would become something far more unsettling. It had begun, as these things often do, with paperwork. A railway clerk had submitted a report, one among hundreds that passed through unnoticed every week. It did not describe a crime, nor did it suggest any immediate danger. Instead, it pointed to a recurring inconsistency in passenger records, something subtle enough to be ignored, but persistent enough to be noticed by someone who paid attention to patterns. The report had been filed more than once. That, in itself, was unusual. Most errors are either corrected or forgotten. They do not return with the same wording, the same concern, and the same quiet insistence that something is not quite right. But this one had. It had appeared again and again, each time attached to the same name. By the time it reached Blackwood, it had already existed longer than most would have tolerated. What drew his attention was not the error itself, but its consistency. Repetition, when it is perfect, is rarely accidental. When he arrived at the station, he did not begin by asking questions. That was never his way. Instead, he observed. He allowed the place to reveal itself in its natural state, without interference, without pressure. The train arrived precisely on schedule, its movement smooth and unremarkable. Passengers stepped onto the platform in a steady flow, each one absorbed in their own direction, their own purpose. There was nothing in their behavior that suggested anything out of the ordinary. No hesitation, no confusion, no sign that one among them should have stood out. And yet, according to the records, someone always did. The name appeared on the passenger list for that train every single day. It was not an unusual name, not one that would attract attention on its own. In fact, it blended perfectly with the others, which may have been part of the reason it had gone unnoticed for so long. What mattered was not the name itself, but what followed it. The ticket associated with it was always marked as used. Not pending, not voided, not left unverified. It had been processed in the same way as every other valid ticket, passing through whatever system governed the station's routine without resistance or anomaly. It indicated, with quiet certainty, that someone had been present, that someone had moved through the necessary point of confirmation, and that the journey had, in some sense, been completed. And yet, there was no corresponding memory of that person. No member of staff could recall seeing him. No passenger had ever described him. There were no reports, no incidents, no fragments of recognition that might suggest he had simply gone unnoticed. It was not that he had been overlooked. It was that he had never been seen at all. When Blackwood examined the records more closely, the pattern revealed itself with a clarity that was difficult to dismiss. The same name appeared again and again, day after day, without interruption. There were no gaps, no missed entries, no irregularities that might suggest a system correcting itself or drifting over time. The repetition was exact. And more importantly, it extended far beyond what anyone had initially assumed. The clerk had traced it back through older ledgers, through records that had long since lost their relevance to anyone but archivists and auditors. Page after page confirmed the same thing. The name had not appeared recently, nor had it begun as a minor anomaly that grew over time. It had always been there. For years. At least 2 decades, according to the oldest records still available. By that point, the question was no longer whether something was wrong, but what kind of explanation could sustain itself for that long without being discovered? There are many ways for a mistake to exist in a system. There are very few ways for it to remain perfect. Blackwood understood this better than most. He knew that errors tend to degrade, to shift, to reveal themselves through inconsistency. They do not maintain structure over years. They do not repeat with precision. And they do not align themselves so neatly with real-world processes that require physical interaction. Because a ticket, once marked as used, implies more than data. It implies presence. Someone must have stood there. Someone must have moved through the station, past whatever point confirmed the validity of that ticket, and continued forward into the system. That part could not be automated away so easily. It required a person. And yet, there was none. The final detail was the one that transformed the situation from unusual to deeply unsettling. It was not discovered immediately, but once it was, it reframed everything that had come before it. The ticket was always purchased only minutes before departure. On its own, this would not have meant much. Last-minute travelers were common, and stations were designed to accommodate them. But the timing, when compared against the station's operations, revealed something that could not be reconciled with normal procedure. The purchase was being recorded at a moment when the ticket office was already closed. Not occasionally. Not due to error or delay. And that was the point at which Blackwood understood that this was no longer a matter of correcting records. It was a matter of explaining how something could exist within a system, without ever appearing in the world that system was meant to describe. There is a particular stillness that exists in the hours just before morning fully takes hold, a quiet interval in which the world seems suspended between what has already passed and what has yet to begin. It is not the heavy silence of night, but something lighter, almost deliberate, as if time itself is moving with greater care. Blackwood arrived at the station within that interval, long before the first train was due to appear. By then, the pattern he had uncovered in the records no longer allowed for passive observation from a distance. It required presence, but not at the moment when the train arrived or the passengers stepped onto the platform. It required attention to the moments that came before, to the narrow span of time in which something was supposed to happen, and yet never could. The station, at that hour, revealed a different character. Without the movement of passengers and the noise of routine, its structure became more apparent, almost exposed in its simplicity. The platforms stretched out in clean, uninterrupted lines, and the overhead lights cast a steady glow that seemed indifferent to whether anyone was there to see it. Nothing appeared concealed. And yet, the absence of activity often made certain details more difficult to ignore. Blackwood moved through the station without haste, allowing his attention to settle naturally rather than directing it with intention. He had learned that environments often resist being questioned directly, but they reveal themselves in subtle ways when left undisturbed. What mattered now was not finding something unusual, but understanding how something impossible could exist within something so ordinary. The first train of the day followed a schedule that had remained unchanged for years, and the records reflected that stability with quiet precision. The name that had drawn his attention appeared within that same structure, repeating itself with a consistency that did not weaken over time. If the pattern was to continue, then the ticket associated with that name would have already been purchased, just as it had been every day before. That detail alone was enough to reshape the way the station had to be understood, because at that hour, no purchase should have been possible. Blackwood directed his attention toward the ticket office, approaching it not with expectation, but with the intention of confirming what was already known. The window remained closed, just as the records and routine suggested it would be. The glass was clear, undisturbed, and the small opening through which transactions were conducted was secured in place. There were no signs of interference, no indication that anyone had accessed it outside of operating hours. Everything existed exactly as it should have. And yet, the records continued to insist that something had taken place within that closed space, something that had left behind a precise and consistent trace. It would have been easy, at that point, to assume that the explanation lay entirely within the system itself, that some internal process, perhaps unnoticed or misunderstood, was responsible for generating the entries that appeared so convincingly real. But Blackwood did not rely on explanations that removed the physical world from the equation. A transaction, even when recorded digitally, still required an origin, required a moment, an action, and a sequence that connected intention to result. Systems may record events, but they do not create them without cause. Time passed without disruption, and the station remained unchanged in its stillness. There were no movements that did not belong, no sounds that broke the quiet continuity of the early hour. If something had occurred, it had done so without leaving behind any visible trace. That absence, however, did not weaken the pattern. It reinforced it. By the time Blackwood turned his attention toward the station's internal systems, he was no longer looking for confirmation that something had happened, but for evidence of how it had been allowed to exist without contradiction. The terminal responded as expected, its interface structured and familiar, offering access to records that were meant to reflect reality as it occurred. He navigated through the data with the same measured precision that defined his approach to everything else, following the sequence of information that corresponded to the morning's first train. The route, the schedule, and the passenger records aligned exactly as they should have, presenting nothing unusual until the point at which the name appeared once again. The entry had already been logged, complete in every detail. The ticket had been issued, validated, and recorded with a timestamp that placed the transaction firmly within the period when the station remained closed. There was no indication that the record had been altered or inserted after the fact. It existed as though it had been created in real time, following the same logic and structure as every other legitimate transaction. This detail did not introduce uncertainty. It removed it, because it meant that the system was not failing. It was functioning exactly as intended. The train arrived soon after, moving into the station with the same quiet precision that had defined it for years. Passengers stepped onto the platform in an orderly flow, their movements unremarkable, their presence blending seamlessly into the routine of the place. Nothing about them suggested that one among them should not exist. And yet, according to everything Blackwood had seen, someone had already passed through the system before any of them arrived. Someone who had no visible origin. He remained still as the moment passed, allowing the pattern to complete itself once again without interruption. There are investigations that advance through action, through confrontation and response, but this was not one of them. This was something that required patience, an understanding that the truth was not hidden behind resistance, but behind perfect consistency. Because whatever had made that purchase had done so in a way that required no presence at all. And more importantly, it had done so without leaving behind anything that could be questioned, which suggested not an error, but a structure. And structures, unlike mistakes, are never accidental. It is often assumed that records exist to reflect reality, to preserve it in a form that can be revisited, studied, and understood long after the moment itself has passed. In most cases, this assumption holds true. The world moves and the system follows, capturing what has already occurred. But there are rare situations in which the relationship appears reversed. where the record exists with such certainty that reality begins to feel secondary to it. By the time the second morning ended, Blackwood had already begun to shift his focus away from the event itself and toward the space that surrounded it. The purchase had occurred, at least according to every system that was meant to verify such things. The timing was precise, the structure intact, and the repetition beyond dispute. What remained unclear was not whether it had happened, but where. The station, in its physical form, offered no immediate answers. Its layout was simple, almost deliberately so, designed for efficiency rather than complexity. There were no unnecessary corridors, no forgotten rooms, no architectural irregularities that might suggest hidden access or overlooked pathways. Everything had a purpose, and everything was accounted for. And yet, something had occurred within it that could not be placed. Blackwood began with the boundaries. Every system, no matter how precise, operates within limits. There are points of entry, points of verification, and points where information transitions from one form to another. If the ticket had been purchased, then the process must have passed through at least one of these points, even if only briefly. The ticket office remained the most obvious candidate, but its condition did not support the idea of access. It had been secured overnight, and nothing about it suggested interference. The mechanisms that controlled its operation were simple and reliable, with no indication that they had been bypassed or altered. If the purchase had not occurred there, then it must have originated elsewhere. This possibility introduced a subtle but important shift in the nature of the investigation. It suggested that the system responsible for issuing the ticket might not be as contained as it appeared, that its point of origin could exist beyond the visible structure of the station. Blackwood turned his attention to the network itself. The station system was not isolated. It functioned as part of a larger framework, connected to other locations, synchronized through processes that ensured consistency across distance. In theory, a transaction could be initiated from another terminal, another station, and still appear within the records of this one. But such an action would leave traces. Every remote access, every external input, created a pathway that could be followed. The system, while efficient, was not designed to conceal its operations. It documented them, layer by layer, with a level of detail that made reconstruction possible. When Blackwood examined those pathways, he found nothing that suggested interference from outside. There were no unexpected connections, no irregular access points, no indications that another location had contributed to the transaction. The origin, as far as the system was concerned, remained local, contained, unquestioned. This brought him back to the station itself, but with a different perspective. If the system believed the transaction had occurred locally and no external source could account for it, then the explanation could not exist outside the station. It had to exist within it, even if it could not be seen. This was the point at which the investigation moved beyond records and into something more abstract. Because the absence of evidence was no longer a limitation. It had become a pattern. Blackwood began to consider not only where the transaction could have taken place, but when it truly belonged. The timestamp provided a precise answer, but precision does not always equate to accuracy. Systems measure time in strict terms, but human experience does not always align with those measurements. There are moments that exist unnoticed, intervals that pass without being observed, gaps so small that they are dismissed as continuity rather than interruption. What if the transaction did not occur outside the expected time, but within a space that no one recognized as separate from it? This idea did not contradict the evidence. It explained it, because if something had happened within a moment that was never fully perceived, then it would not require concealment. It would not need to hide because it would never be acknowledged in the first place. Blackwood returned once more to the physical layout of the station, but this time his attention was not on what was present, but on what was assumed. The spaces between functions, the transitions between one state and another, the brief intervals in which no one was looking. The station did not need to contain a hidden room or a secret passage. It only needed to contain a moment. The train schedule reinforced this idea in a way that was difficult to ignore. Every arrival and departure followed a strict pattern, but within that pattern were small margins of time that existed only as transitions. The period just before the first train, when the station was technically inactive, yet already preparing to become operational. It was a state that belonged neither to night nor to day. A threshold. And thresholds, by their nature, are rarely observed with precision. If the transaction occurred within that threshold, then it would not be recorded as an anomaly. It would be absorbed into the system as a valid event, aligned with the beginning of operation even if it technically preceded it. The system would not question it, because from its perspective, nothing unusual had taken place. This line of reasoning did not provide a complete answer, but it narrowed the possibilities in a way that made the problem more defined. The transaction was not random, nor was it the result of a failure. It followed a structure that aligned with the station's operations, even as it existed just outside of them, which suggested intention. And intention, unlike error, leaves behind a different kind of trace. Not in the form of visible evidence, but in the consistency of its execution. By the time Blackwood stepped back from the records and the systems that governed them, the nature of the case had shifted once again. It was no longer simply about a missing person, or even an impossible transaction. It had become something more precise, something that existed within the narrow space between what was recorded and what was ever truly seen. And within that space, the question was no longer whether someone had been there, but whether the station itself had allowed it to happen. There is a certain confidence people place in recorded images, a quiet belief that what is captured by a camera carries a kind of certainty that memory cannot provide. Where human observation may falter, machines are expected to remain precise, impartial, and complete. In most cases, this assumption proves reliable. But like all systems, cameras do not capture reality in its entirety. They capture only what falls within their frame, within their timing, within the limits of what they are designed to observe. And it is often within those limits that the most important details are lost. By the third day of observation, Blackwood had already exhausted what the records alone could offer. The pattern remained intact, the system remained consistent, and the impossibility of the transaction had not weakened under scrutiny. If anything, it had become more defined, which left only one direction to pursue. If the system claimed that something had occurred, then there should exist some form of visual confirmation, however small or indirect it might be. Not necessarily the act itself, but the effect of it. A movement, a delay, a presence where there should have been none. The station's surveillance system was modest but sufficient. Cameras had been placed to monitor entrances, platforms, and key operational areas, including the ticket office. Their purpose was not to track individuals in detail, but to ensure that nothing disrupted the ordinary flow of the station's routine. It was a system built for oversight, not investigation. Blackwood reviewed the recordings with the same patience he applied to everything else, allowing time to pass without rushing toward conclusion. He understood that what he was looking for might not present itself as an obvious event, but as a deviation so slight that it could easily be dismissed. The footage from the previous morning aligned perfectly with expectation. The station remained empty during the early hours, its stillness uninterrupted by movement. The ticket office remained closed, its window undisturbed, its surroundings unchanged. No one approached it, no one lingered near it, and no action occurred that might suggest interaction. The timeline progressed without interruption until the moment the station began to awaken. Lights remained constant. Shadows remained stable. Nothing entered the frame that did not belong. At first glance, the footage appeared to confirm what had already been observed in person. Nothing had happened. And yet, according to the system, something had. Blackwood did not stop at a single recording. He moved back through previous days, then weeks, allowing the repetition of the footage to reveal what a single moment could not. The station repeated itself in visual form just as it had in the records, each morning unfolding in the same quiet sequence. And each time, the same absence persisted. There was no figure arriving early, no delayed reflection in the glass, no subtle shift in the environment that might suggest the presence of someone moving just beyond clear visibility. If anything, the footage was too consistent. It presented a version of reality that was complete within its own limits, but those limits had now become part of the problem. Because the system that recorded transactions insisted that something had occurred within that same time frame, which meant that either the cameras had failed to capture it, or it had taken place in a way that required no visibility at all. This possibility did not introduce contradiction. It aligned with everything Blackwood had observed so far. The transaction existed within the system without visible origin. The station remained unchanged in its physical state. The timing aligned perfectly with a period that resisted direct observation. Taken together, these details suggested not that something had been missed, but that something had been positioned, placed precisely within the boundaries of what would not be seen. Blackwood began to consider the nature of those boundaries more carefully. Cameras do not observe continuously in the way people assume. They record frames, sequences of still images presented in rapid succession, creating the illusion of uninterrupted motion. Between those frames, however brief, there are intervals, moments that exist but are not captured. In most situations, those intervals are meaningless. They are too small to contain anything of consequence, too brief to alter the continuity of what is being observed. But this was not most situations. If something had been designed to exist within those intervals, to occur in the precise moments that fell between recorded frames, then it would not appear in the footage at all. It would leave behind no visual trace, no distortion, no anomaly that could be identified through standard review. The recording would remain complete. And yet, something would be missing from it. Blackwood did not immediately accept this conclusion, but he did not dismiss it either. It provided a framework that did not conflict with the evidence, a way to understand how something could occur without ever appearing. Still, there was another detail that required attention. Even if the act itself had not been captured, the consequences of it might have been. A door that shifted, a surface that reflected movement, a change so small that it would not draw attention unless one knew exactly when to look. He adjusted the footage, slowing it down, allowing each frame to hold longer than it was meant to. Time, when stretched, reveals patterns that are otherwise invisible, and subtle changes become easier to detect. The station unfolded again, frame by frame. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. Nothing betrayed the presence of anything beyond what was expected. And yet, the certainty of the system remained untouched. The ticket had been purchased. The record existed. The pattern continued. Blackwood eventually stepped away from the footage, not because it had failed to provide answers, but because it had confirmed something more important. The absence was not accidental. It was consistent. And consistency, when it aligns across multiple systems, is rarely the result of chance. It is the result of something that has been arranged to function without interruption, without deviation, and without drawing attention to itself. By the time the next morning approached, the investigation had moved beyond the question of visibility. It was no longer about whether someone could be seen. It was about whether someone needed to be seen at all. Because whatever had been moving through that station had done so in a way that required no witness, no reflection, and no presence within the frame of observation. And that suggested something far more precise than concealment. It suggested control. Not over the station itself, but over the conditions in which it could be observed. And that kind of control does not happen by accident. There is a difference between something that exists in a system and something that can be held in the hand. Digital records, no matter how precise, remain abstract in their nature. They describe, they confirm, they preserve, but they do not occupy space in the same way physical objects do. Paper, on the other hand, carries presence. It absorbs time, pressure, and environment in ways that cannot be replicated or easily altered. A ticket, once printed, becomes more than a record. It becomes evidence of a moment that once existed, a trace that can be examined not only for what it says, but for how it came to be. By the time Blackwood turned his attention to the physical tickets, the investigation had already moved beyond the possibility of simple explanation. The system was consistent, the footage offered no contradiction, and the pattern had proven itself too stable to be dismissed as error. What remained was the question of material proof. If the tickets associated with that name truly existed, then they would carry within them the same precision as the records, but also something more subtle. They would reflect the conditions of their creation, the environment in which they had been printed, and the sequence through which they had passed. The clerk had preserved a number of them, not out of protocol, but out of instinct. Something about the repetition had been enough to justify holding on to what would otherwise have been discarded. Blackwood examined them carefully, not searching for immediate irregularities, but allowing the details to emerge through comparison. At first glance, they appeared entirely ordinary. The paper was standard, the print consistent, and the formatting identical to every other ticket issued by the station. There were no visible distortions, no signs of tampering, no indications that they had been produced by any means other than the official system. But consistency, in this case, was not reassurance. It was part of the anomaly. Each ticket had been printed at a time when the station was closed, yet none of them reflected any deviation from normal operation. The ink distribution was even, the alignment precise, and the pressure marks consistent with a functioning machine operating under standard conditions. There were no signs of interruption, no faint impressions that might suggest a delayed process or an incomplete cycle, which implied that the machine responsible for printing them had not only been active, but fully operational. This detail introduced a new layer to the problem, because if the ticket printer had been used, then it had done so without leaving behind any trace of activation beyond the ticket itself. No logs indicated unscheduled use, no maintenance records suggested irregular activity, and no physical inspection revealed signs of recent operation outside of expected hours. The machine, like the system, behaved as though nothing unusual had occurred. Blackwood considered the relationship between the printer and the ticket office itself. Under normal circumstances, access to the printer required access to the space in which it was housed. It was not a remote device, nor was it designed to function independently of the station's operational controls. To produce a ticket, someone had to be present. That assumption had held true in every case the system had been designed to handle. And yet, the evidence suggested otherwise. The tickets existed, each one confirming a transaction that should not have been possible, and each one doing so with a level of precision that excluded the possibility of error. There were no flawed prints, no incomplete entries, no variation that might suggest instability in the process. The repetition extended not only to the data, but to the physical form itself. Blackwood shifted his focus from the printed information to the material characteristics of the tickets. Paper, unlike digital records, retains subtle traces of its environment. Temperature, humidity, and handling can all leave behind signs that, while not immediately visible, become apparent under careful examination. If the tickets had been produced in a different context, or under different conditions, those differences might reveal themselves in the smallest details. But nothing distinguished them. They felt identical to every other ticket issued by the station. The texture, the weight, even the slight rigidity of the paper suggested uniformity in storage and production. There were no irregularities in how they had been handled, no marks that might indicate they had been transported or preserved outside of normal procedure. It was as though they had passed through the system in the same way as every other ticket, without exception. This reinforced a conclusion that had been forming gradually. Whatever process was responsible for their creation was not interfering with the system. It was operating within it. That distinction mattered. An error disrupts. An intrusion leaves traces. But something that functions within a system, without altering it, suggests a different kind of presence entirely. One that does not force its way in, but exists as though it belongs there. Blackwood set the tickets aside, not because they had failed to provide information, but because they had confirmed something more significant than any visible irregularity. They had confirmed that the anomaly was not limited to records or timing. It extended into the physical world. The transaction was not theoretical. It had produced something real, and that meant that whatever had initiated it had done so with the ability to move through both systems at once. By the time he stepped back from the examination, the nature of the case had shifted again, becoming more precise, but also more difficult to define. It was no longer sufficient to question how the purchase had occurred or why the name continued to appear. The question had become more fundamental. Not who was responsible, but what kind of presence could exist within a system so completely that it left behind proof without ever leaving behind itself. There is a quiet assumption that if something happens often enough, someone will eventually remember it. Repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity leaves traces in the mind, even when attention is not consciously given. But memory is not a perfect record. It is selective, shaped as much by expectation as by experience, and it often preserves what fits within an established pattern while discarding what does not. By the time Blackwood turned his attention to the people who worked at the station, the investigation had already established a structure that was difficult to challenge. The records were consistent, the physical evidence aligned with them, and the absence of any visible presence had been confirmed through observation. What remained uncertain was whether that absence extended to human perception, or whether it had simply gone unnoticed. The staff at the station operated within a routine that rarely changed. Their responsibilities were defined by schedules, procedures, and small, repetitive actions that required attention without demanding reflection. Over time, such environments tend to produce a kind of automatic awareness, where actions are performed correctly, but without conscious engagement with every detail. It was within that state that something unusual could exist without being recognized. Blackwood did not approach this part of the investigation by asking direct questions, nor did he expect clear answers. Instead, he examined the conditions under which memory formed, and more importantly, the conditions under which it failed. If a person had been arriving at the station every day for 20 years, then under normal circumstances, someone would have noticed. Not necessarily remembered with precision, but recognized in passing. A familiar face, a repeated presence, something that would leave behind at least a fragment of acknowledgement. But that had not happened. There were no recollections, no vague impressions, no uncertain confirmations that someone matching that pattern had ever been seen. The absence was not partial. It was complete. This suggested something more complex than simple oversight. It suggested that the presence, if it existed, did not register in a way that could be retained. Blackwood considered the possibility that the individual associated with the name might have blended so perfectly into the routine that he had effectively become invisible within it. There are people who pass through spaces without drawing attention, whose movements align so closely with expectation that they do not stand out, even when observed directly. But even such individuals leave behind traces in memory, a sense of familiarity, a recognition that something has been seen before. The complete absence of such traces indicated that something else was at work. It was not merely that the person was unremarkable. It was that the act of noticing never fully occurred. This realization shifted the focus once again, moving it away from the idea of concealment and towards something more subtle. If the presence did not register, then it did not need to hide. It existed outside the threshold at which attention becomes memory, passing through the station in a way that did not leave behind the cognitive imprint required for recall. The environment of the station supported this possibility in ways that were easy to overlook. The early hours of the morning, particularly before the first train, created a state in which attention was naturally reduced. The absence of activity, combined with the predictability of routine, encouraged a kind of passive awareness. In such conditions, even visible events can fail to be fully processed. A movement may be seen, but not interpreted. A figure may pass, but not be recognized. And without recognition, There is no memory. Blackwood began to consider whether the pattern itself contributed to this effect. The repetition of the same event, occurring at the same time, under the same conditions, could gradually reinforce the expectation that nothing unusual was taking place. Over time, that expectation becomes dominant, shaping perception in a way that filters out anything that does not immediately contradict it. If something existed within that filtered space, it would not need to avoid detection. It would simply never be processed as significant. This line of reasoning did not provide a direct answer, but it aligned with the evidence in a way that previous explanations had not. The absence of memory was no longer a contradiction. It became part of the pattern itself, another layer of consistency that supported the idea that whatever was happening was not random. It was structured, deliberately positioned within the limits of human perception. Blackwood did not rely on this conclusion alone, but he did not dismiss it either. It provided a framework that connected the physical and the psychological, offering a way to understand how something could exist within a system and yet remain entirely absent from human awareness. By the time he stepped away from this line of inquiry, the investigation had become less about identifying a person and more about defining a condition. The name in the records no longer pointed to an individual in the conventional sense, but to a presence that operated within specific boundaries, both physical and perceptual. And those boundaries, once understood, began to reveal something else. Because if something could pass through the station without being remembered, then the question was no longer whether it had been seen, but whether it had ever been truly perceived at all. Time, in most systems, is treated as an absolute. It is recorded, divided, synchronized, and trusted without question. Every event is assigned a precise position within it, and from that position, meaning is derived. A second too early or too late can change the interpretation of what has occurred, and so accuracy becomes essential. But accuracy depends on alignment, and alignment, even in well-designed systems, is rarely perfect. By the time Blackwood began to examine the timestamps more closely, the investigation had already established that the transaction existed, that it followed a consistent pattern, and that it occurred within a window that should not have allowed it. What had not yet been questioned was the nature of that timing itself. The records displayed the moment of purchase with exact precision, down to the minute, and in some cases, even further. On the surface, nothing appeared unusual. The entries aligned with the structure of the system, each one positioned exactly where it was expected to be. But precision, when repeated without variation, can sometimes conceal more than it reveals. Blackwood began by comparing the timestamps across multiple days, not searching for differences, but for the absence of them. Patterns often reveal themselves not through change, but through an unnatural consistency that resists even the smallest deviation. The result was immediate and unmistakable. Every recorded purchase occurred at the exact same minute. Not approximately, not within a narrow range, but precisely the same point in time, repeated across days, weeks, and years without exception. Under normal circumstances, such consistency would be impossible. Even automated systems introduce slight variations, influenced by processing delays, network synchronization, and internal adjustments that occur without notice. Over time, these variations accumulate, creating a natural spread that reflects the complexity of real-world operation. But here, there was no spread. The timestamp did not drift. It did not adjust. It remained fixed. This detail altered the structure of the problem in a subtle but significant way. It suggested that the transaction was not simply occurring at a consistent time, but that it was anchored to it, as though the moment itself was not being recorded, but selected. Blackwood extended his examination beyond the station's local system, tracing how time was maintained across the network. Like most systems of its kind, the station synchronized its internal clock with a central reference, ensuring that all recorded events aligned with a broader standard. In theory, this eliminated discrepancies. In practice, it reduced them. There were always minor differences, small corrections applied over time to maintain alignment. These adjustments were routine, expected, and rarely noticeable unless examined closely. When Blackwood compared those adjustments to the recorded transactions, he found something that should not have been possible. The system's time had shifted as all systems do. The transaction had not. It remained fixed to the same minute, unaffected by the gradual corrections that influenced everything else. Even when the system's internal clock adjusted slightly forward or backward, the timestamp of the purchase did not reflect those changes. It existed independently. This suggested that the transaction was not being generated in response to the system's current state, but rather inserted in a way that ignored it. Not as an error, but as something that followed its own reference. Blackwood considered what this implied in practical terms. If the timestamp did not align with the natural behavior of the system, then it could not have been produced through the same processes that governed normal transactions. It had to originate from somewhere else. Not necessarily outside the system, but outside the way the system understood time. This distinction introduced a level of complexity that could not be resolved through physical inspection alone. It required an understanding of how systems interpret sequence, how events are ordered, and how those orders can be manipulated without disrupting the structure that depends on them. In most cases, altering a timestamp would leave traces, discrepancies, conflicts with other recorded events. But here, there were none. The transaction existed in perfect alignment with everything around it, even as it remained unaffected by the factors that influenced those same records. It was not out of place. It simply did not belong to the same flow. By the time Blackwood stepped back from the data, the pattern had gained a new dimension. It was no longer defined solely by repetition or absence, but by precision of a kind that exceeded normal operation. The exact minute had become more than a detail. It had become a boundary, a fixed point that did not move, did not adjust, and did not respond to the system in which it appeared. And that raised a question that could not be ignored. If the moment of the transaction was not determined by the system, then what exactly was determining it? Because whatever controlled that timing was not simply using the station. It was operating alongside it, following a structure that remained invisible, yet perfectly aligned with everything that could be observed. And that kind of alignment is never accidental. Every pattern, no matter how stable or long-lasting, must begin at a specific point in time, even if that point is no longer easy to locate. Continuity creates the illusion that something has always existed, but records, when preserved carefully enough, have a way of revealing origins that would otherwise remain hidden. By the time Blackwood turned his attention to the earliest available entries, the investigation had already established that the repetition extended back at least 2 decades, maintaining a level of precision that resisted any conventional explanation. The name appeared without interruption, the transaction aligned perfectly with the same impossible conditions, and the timing remained fixed in a way that suggested deliberate structure rather than coincidence. What remained unclear was how it had started. The station's archive was not designed for easy navigation. Older records had been stored without expectation of future relevance, organized more for preservation than accessibility. Ledgers had been moved, reclassified, and in some cases, partially restored from earlier formats, creating a layered history that required patience to reconstruct. Blackwood approached this process with the same methodical attention that had guided every step of the investigation so far. He did not search for a specific date, but for the moment at which the pattern ceased to exist, reasoning that the absence of the name would be easier to identify than its presence. This approach proved effective. As he moved backward through the records, the repetition continued with unbroken consistency, each page reinforcing the same structure that had already been observed. Days became months, months became years, and still the name appeared, fixed in its position, unchanged in its behavior. It was only after a considerable passage through older entries that the pattern finally broke. The name was no longer there. The absence was immediate and unmistakable, not gradual or inconsistent. but complete. The entries before that point followed the expected structure of ordinary records, with no indication that anything unusual had ever existed within them. This transition did not suggest decay or error. It suggested a beginning. Blackwood narrowed his focus to the boundary between presence and absence, examining the entries immediately surrounding that point with greater precision. The final pages without the name contained nothing of interest beyond their normal function, which in itself became significant, as it confirmed that the anomaly had not evolved from something smaller. It had appeared fully formed. When the name first emerged, it did so without introduction or deviation from the pattern that would define it for the next 20 years. The transaction was recorded with the same exact timing, the same validation, and the same alignment with a system that should not have allowed it. There was no gradual shift, no experimental phase, no early irregularities that might suggest development. The pattern did not begin. It arrived. This detail altered the structure of the investigation in a way that extended beyond the station itself. It suggested that whatever was responsible for the transaction had not been created within the system, but had entered it already complete, already defined, and already capable of sustaining itself without variation. Blackwood examined the surrounding records for any indication of external change that might correspond with this moment. Station renovations, system upgrades, procedural adjustments, any event that could have introduced a new variable into the environment. There were none. The station, at that time, functioned as it always had, following the same schedules, the same routines, and the same operational structure that would continue unchanged for years afterward. Nothing in its history explained the appearance of the pattern. This absence of cause did not weaken the significance of the first entry. It reinforced it, because it suggested that the origin of the pattern did not belong to the station's timeline. It intersected with it. Blackwood considered the implications of this carefully, recognizing that the distinction between origin and intersection was not merely semantic. If something begins within a system, it carries with it traces of that system's limitations, its inconsistencies, and its gradual development. But if something enters a system from outside its natural progression, it can appear fully formed, unaffected by the processes that would normally shape it. The first entry reflected the latter. It did not behave like an anomaly that had grown over time. It behaved like a condition that had been introduced. By the time Blackwood closed the ledger, the investigation had moved beyond the question of how long the pattern had existed and into a more precise and difficult area of understanding. The repetition was no longer the most significant detail. The beginning was, because it marked the moment at which something that did not belong to the station had become part of it, not through force or disruption, but through perfect integration. And once that integration had occurred, it had never faltered. The name continued to appear, the transaction continued to exist, and the system continued to accept it without resistance, which suggested that whatever had entered the station's records at that point had not simply found a way in. It had found a way to remain. And in doing so, it had created something far more stable than an error, far more precise than a coincidence, and far more difficult to remove than anything that could be traced to a single cause. Because the first entry was not just the beginning of a pattern. It was the moment the system stopped being complete on its own. By the time the origin of the pattern had been established, the investigation had already shifted away from the idea of error and towards something far more structured. The records were consistent, the timing was fixed, and the first appearance of the name had confirmed that the pattern had entered the system fully formed, without transition or development. What remained uncertain was how far that structure extended beyond the act of purchase itself. Until that point, the focus had remained on the station, on the moment before departure, and on the conditions that allowed the transaction to exist. But a ticket, by its nature, implies more than a single point in time. It connects two locations, two moments, and the movement between them. If the ticket had been used, then the journey it represented should have left traces beyond the station where it began. Blackwood turned his attention to the train itself. The route had remained unchanged for years, following the same schedule, stopping at the same platforms, and carrying passengers through a sequence that had become almost mechanical in its predictability. The consistency of that route made it an ideal extension of the pattern, as any deviation within it would be easier to detect. Passenger records for the train confirmed what had already been observed at the station of departure. The same name appeared on every journey, aligned with the same ticket, the same timing, and the same expectation of presence. But presence, in this case, was not something that could be confirmed directly. What could be confirmed, however, was allocation. Each ticket corresponded to a specific seat, a position within the physical structure of the train that was meant to be occupied for the duration of the journey. That assignment created a link between the abstract record and the tangible environment of the train itself. If the ticket existed, then the seat should have been used. Blackwood examined the seating records across multiple journeys, tracing the position associated with the name. The assignment did not change. Day after day, the same seat appeared, fixed within the same carriage, forming a secondary pattern that mirrored the first. This consistency introduced a new point of observation. Unlike the station, where movement was brief and difficult to isolate, the train provided a contained environment in which presence, even subtle, could be inferred through interaction with space. Passengers sit, shift, adjust, leave behind small indications of having been there. Even in the absence of direct observation, the use of a seat tends to produce signs that it has not remained empty. Where? Displacement. Minor disturbances that accumulate over time. Blackwood extended his examination to those details, reviewing reports from train staff, maintenance logs, and cleaning records that documented the condition of the carriages after each journey. These records were not designed to track individual passengers, but they did reflect the general use of the space. What they revealed did not align with expectation. The seat associated with the name showed no signs of consistent use. It was not marked as broken, nor was it excluded from service. It existed within the carriage as a fully functional part of the train, available to any passenger who held a valid ticket. And yet, it did not exhibit the subtle patterns of wear that would normally accompany daily occupancy. At the same time, it was not consistently empty. There were occasional notes indicating that the seat had been occupied, though never in a way that stood out. No passenger had claimed it as their own, no irregularity had been reported, and no pattern of usage had been identified beyond the standard flow of seating adjustments that occur on any train. This contradiction did not present itself as an error. It presented itself as uncertainty. The seat existed within the system as occupied, yet within the physical environment, it did not behave as though it belonged to a single, repeating presence. Blackwood considered the implications of this carefully, recognizing that the distinction between recorded occupancy and physical use was not easily resolved. If the seat had been consistently occupied by the same individual, then the evidence would likely have reflected that, even if only subtly. The absence of such evidence suggested a different possibility, that the presence associated with the ticket did not interact with the space in a way that produced lasting traces. This idea aligned with what had already been observed at the station. The transaction existed, the ticket was validated, and yet no one had been seen. The system confirmed presence, but the physical world did not retain it. The train extended that contradiction. The seat was assigned, the journey was recorded, but the space itself remained largely unaffected. Blackwood broadened the scope of his examination to include the duration of the journey itself, considering whether the pattern might reveal itself not through static evidence, but through the passage of time. A person occupying a seat for that long would inevitably interact with their surroundings, even in the smallest ways. But no such interaction could be isolated. The journey began. It continued. It ended. And within that sequence, the presence remained undefined. By the time the train reached its destination, the pattern completed itself in the same way it always had. The passenger records reflected a full journey, the system accepted the continuity without question, and the name remained in place as though it had followed the route like any other. And yet, no one recalled seeing the individual disembark. No staff member noted an absence, no irregularity was reported, and no gap in the flow of passengers suggested that someone had failed to arrive. The journey, like the purchase, existed within the system with perfect consistency, while the physical reality surrounding it remained untouched. This reinforced a conclusion that had been forming gradually, becoming more defined with each layer of the investigation. The presence associated with the name did not behave like a person moving through space. It behaved like a condition moving through a system, one that aligned with structure, followed sequence, and completed itself without requiring the physical traces that would normally confirm its existence. By the time Blackwood returned his attention to the station, the question had shifted once again. It was no longer about how the ticket had been purchased or even how the journey had been completed. It was about what exactly had traveled, because whatever occupied that seat did not need to leave it. Up to that point, the investigation had unfolded without direct interference, guided by the assumption that the pattern would reveal itself more clearly if it were allowed to continue undisturbed. The records had been examined, the systems observed, and the physical environment studied with care, all of which had led to the same conclusion that whatever was occurring did so with a level of consistency that resisted conventional explanation. However, there comes a stage in any investigation where observation alone is no longer sufficient, and the structure of what is being studied begins to invite a different kind of approach. When a pattern becomes too precise, too stable, and too resistant to variation, it becomes necessary to determine whether that stability is inherent or merely unchallenged. Blackwood reached that point without urgency, but with certainty. Rather than searching for additional evidence within the pattern itself, he began to consider how it might respond to change. A system, no matter how controlled, is ultimately defined not only by what it produces, but by how it reacts when its conditions are altered. If the transaction was truly integrated into the station's operations, then even a subtle shift in those operations should have produced some form of deviation. If it did not, then the implications would extend beyond anything the station could account for. The point of intervention was selected with precision. The ticket office, which had remained closed during the critical window of time, represented one of the central contradictions in the entire structure of the case. The transaction occurred when it should not have been possible, and yet the system accepted it without question. If that condition were changed, even slightly, it might reveal whether the process depended on the station's state or existed independently of it. On the following morning, the station was opened earlier than usual. The adjustment was minimal in practical terms, amounting to little more than a shift in routine, but its significance lay in the fact that it removed the very condition that had defined the anomaly. The ticket office was accessible, the system fully active, and the expectation of inactivity during that period no longer applied. From within the station's operational logic, everything now aligned with what should have been possible. Blackwood observed the sequence as it unfolded, not with expectation, but with the same measured attention that had guided the investigation from the beginning. The station transitioned into operation earlier than it had in years, and the systems that governed it responded accordingly, functioning as they were designed to. When the moment approached, the pattern did not hesitate. The record appeared at the exact same minute, the transaction aligned with the same structure, and the name returned without variation or delay. The presence of an open ticket office did not alter the outcome, nor did it introduce any deviation that might suggest dependence on that condition. This result did not complicate the investigation. It clarified it, because it demonstrated that the transaction was not tied to the state of the station in the way that had been assumed. Whether the system was active or inactive, open or closed, the event occurred in precisely the same way, unaffected by the change in environment. Blackwood extended the test in a more deliberate direction. On the following day, a specific component of the system was temporarily removed from operation. The ticket printer associated with the office was taken offline during the window in which the transaction was expected to occur, creating a condition in which a physical ticket could not be produced through normal means. The intention was not to disrupt the entire system, but to isolate a single pathway and observe whether the transaction depended on it. If it did, the pattern would fail. If it did not, the implications would become more difficult to contain. The outcome remained unchanged. The record appeared at the same fixed moment. The transaction was confirmed within the system, and once the printer was restored, the physical ticket existed as though it had been produced without interruption. Its form, its structure, and its material characteristics were indistinguishable from those examined previously, offering no indication that anything in the process had been affected. This detail introduced a level of precision to the problem that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or error. It suggested that the process responsible for the transaction did not rely on the mechanisms that were meant to produce it, but instead operated in parallel with them, aligning its results with the system without depending on its internal functions. Over the following days, additional variations were introduced, each one designed to test a different aspect of the station's operation. Access points were monitored more closely, timing was adjusted in subtle ways, and sequences that governed normal activity were altered within reasonable limits. None of these changes produced any measurable effect on the pattern. The transaction continued to occur with the same consistency, the same timing, and the same alignment with a structure that no longer appeared to belong to the station itself. By the time Blackwood concluded this phase of the investigation, the nature of the case had shifted once again, becoming both more defined and more resistant to explanation. The pattern could not be interrupted, not because it resisted interference, but because it did not recognize it. From its perspective, nothing had changed. It continued to function according to its own structure, intersecting with the station only at the precise moment required to produce a result, and remaining entirely unaffected by everything outside that moment. This realization narrowed the scope of the investigation in a way that left little room for ambiguity. The transaction did not originate within the station's systems, nor did it depend on them for its execution. It existed alongside them, aligned just closely enough to appear legitimate, while remaining entirely independent in its operation. And that meant that whatever had been repeating this process for the past 20 years was not something that could be stopped by changing the system it appeared within. It was something that followed its own structure entirely, intersecting with the station only where its pattern required it to. And in doing so, it revealed a final, unsettling implication. The station was not the source of the anomaly. It was only the place where it became visible. By the time the station itself had been ruled out as the source of the anomaly, the investigation had already begun to extend beyond the place where the pattern first became visible. The records, the systems, and the physical environment had all pointed toward the same conclusion, that the transaction did not originate within the station, but merely intersected with it at a precise and consistent point in time. What remained was the other end of that structure. A ticket does not exist in isolation, and its meaning is not defined solely by the act of purchase. It carries within it the expectation of arrival, of completion, and of a journey that resolves itself in a specific place. Without that endpoint, the process remains conceptually unfinished, even if the system records it as complete. Up to that point, the destination had not been examined with the same depth as the departure. It had been treated as stable, assumed to follow the same logic that governed the rest of the system. The train arrived, passengers disembarked, and the sequence concluded without drawing attention. But stability, when left unexamined, often conceals its own inconsistencies. Blackwood redirected his attention toward the final station on the route, approaching it not as a separate environment, but as the continuation of a structure that had already proven itself resistant to explanation. If the pattern extended beyond the moment of departure, then it would reveal itself there, not necessarily through visibility, but through the conditions that defined arrival. The destination station differed in character from the one where the investigation had begun. It was larger, more active, and less confined by routine, its flow shaped by overlapping schedules and a greater number of passengers moving through it at any given time. Where the original station had offered clarity through its simplicity, This one introduced complexity that made individual movement more difficult to isolate. And yet, the pattern remained unaffected by that complexity. The same name appeared within the arrival records with the same precision that had defined its departure, aligning perfectly with the system's expectation that the journey had been completed. From a structural perspective, nothing was missing and nothing suggested that any part of the process had failed to occur. What was absent, once again, was confirmation within the physical world. Blackwood examined the conditions of arrival in the same way he had approached the station of departure, focusing not on what should have been visible, but on what should have remained after the moment had passed. Passengers arriving at a station create subtle but consistent traces through movement, interaction, and the gradual dispersion of presence into the surrounding environment. Even when no one is observed directly, the structure of arrival itself produces evidence that something has occurred. In this case, that structure remained incomplete. There was no indication that the individual associated with the name had ever stepped onto the platform, no recollection from staff, and no irregularity within the flow of passengers that might suggest someone had been overlooked. The movement of the crowd absorbed everything into a uniform pattern, leaving no distinction between what had occurred and what had not. This absence did not contradict the records. It reflected them. Just as the departure existed without visible origin, the arrival existed without visible confirmation. The system recorded a complete journey, but the physical environment did not retain any trace that would support that completion. Blackwood began to consider whether the destination, like the station of departure, functioned not as a true endpoint, but as another point of intersection. The journey appeared complete because the system defined it as such, but that definition did not necessarily correspond to a movement that followed conventional spatial logic. If the pattern represented a form of movement, then the stations marked only the moments at which that movement became visible within the system. Everything beyond those moments remained unobserved. This perspective aligned with the evidence in a way that required no contradiction. It allowed for the existence of a journey that began, continued, and concluded within the system, while remaining unbound by the physical expectations that would normally define such a process. By the time Blackwood stepped away from the arrival records, the structure of the case had become more complete, but also more difficult to contain within familiar terms. The pattern extended across departure, transit, and arrival, connecting each stage with a precision that left no room for error, while simultaneously avoiding any form of direct observation. The name continued to move through the system, not as a person traveling between two locations, but as something that passed through defined points without ever being fully contained by them. This realization introduced a question that could not be answered through further examination of records or systems alone. If the journey did not truly begin at the station and did not truly end at its destination, then the route that connected those points could not be understood as a simple line between two places. It suggested the existence of something else entirely, something that followed its own path, intersecting with the visible world only where it was required to leave behind proof that it had passed through. And that meant that the train, the stations, and the system itself were not the full extent of what was taking place. They were only the parts that could be recorded. Up to that point, the investigation had followed structure, timing, and space, gradually revealing that the pattern extended beyond any single system while remaining perfectly aligned with all of them. The stations, the train, and the records had all confirmed the same unsettling truth, that the journey existed without requiring a visible presence, and that its consistency was not the result of error, but of something far more deliberate. What had not yet been fully examined was the name itself. It had been present from the beginning, repeated across years with the same precision as every other element of the pattern. It did not stand out, did not suggest anything unusual on its own, and yet it served as the only constant that could be traced across the entire structure. A name, in most cases, carries history. It connects to records beyond the immediate system, to documents, registrations, and traces of existence that extend into the broader world. Even when a person is not widely known, Their name exists somewhere within the network of information that defines identity. Blackwood began to follow that thread, extending the investigation beyond the station and into the records that existed outside of it. If the name belonged to a real individual, then it would leave behind evidence of that existence in places that were not bound to the railway system. At first, the search appeared to confirm what would normally be expected. The name existed. It appeared in databases, in fragments of records, in places where such a name could reasonably belong. There were references that suggested identity, traces that aligned with the structure of documentation, and enough information to imply that the name was not fabricated within the station's system alone. But as the examination continued, those traces began to lose their coherence. The records did not connect. They did not form a continuous history. Instead, they appeared as isolated points, each one suggesting existence, but none of them aligning with one another in a way that could form a complete narrative. Dates did not match, locations did not correspond, and the sequence of information failed to establish a consistent timeline. It was not that the name lacked history. It was that its history could not exist in a single, continuous form. This distinction introduced a new level of complexity to the investigation, because it suggested that the name was not tied to a single identity, but existed as something that could appear in multiple contexts without maintaining continuity between them. Each trace of it seemed valid when examined on its own, but when placed together, they failed to resolve into a single, coherent existence. Blackwood considered the implications carefully, recognizing that this pattern mirrored what had already been observed within the station. The transaction existed, the journey was recorded, and the system confirmed each step without contradiction, yet the physical presence associated with it could not be established. The name followed the same logic. It existed, but it did not belong. This realization shifted the investigation away from the idea of identifying a person and towards something more abstract. If the name did not correspond to a single individual, then it could not be used to trace a conventional path through records, documents, or history. Instead, it functioned as a point of reference, a marker within the system, something that allowed the pattern to maintain consistency without requiring the presence of a fixed identity. The longer Blackwood examined it, the clearer this distinction became. The name did not behave like something that had been assigned to a person, but like something that had been assigned to the pattern itself, providing it with a form that could be recorded, repeated, and recognized without ever being fully defined. This did not contradict the evidence. It unified it, because it explained how the same name could appear across years without change, how it could exist within multiple systems without forming a coherent history, and how it could remain perfectly consistent without being tied to a single, observable individual. By the time Blackwood stepped back from this line of inquiry, the investigation had reached a point where the distinction between identity and function could no longer be ignored. The name was no longer the key to finding a person. It was part of the mechanism that allowed the pattern to exist. And that realization introduced a final layer to the problem that had not yet been fully explored. Because if the name was not an identity, but a function, then the question was no longer who had been traveling. It was what required that name in order to continue. And whatever the answer to that question might be, it did not belong to any system that had been examined so far. By the time the investigation reached the stage where the name itself could no longer be treated as a conventional identity, the structure of the pattern had already expanded beyond the limits of any single system. The station, the train, and the records had all confirmed that what was taking place did not behave like an anomaly contained within a closed environment, but rather like a process that intersected with multiple systems while remaining fundamentally independent of all of them. At that point, Blackwood began to shift his attention away from what remained constant and toward the possibility of introducing a condition that the pattern might not be able to absorb without revealing something about its structure. All previous attempts to interfere with the station's operations had produced no measurable effect, which suggested that the pattern did not respond to changes within that environment. However, it did not necessarily follow that it existed entirely beyond influence. only that the methods used so far had not reached the level at which it operated. What remained untested was time itself, not as it was measured within the station's system, but as it functioned in relation to that system when minor corrections were introduced. Although time is often treated as an absolute within recorded environments, it is, in practice, subject to small adjustments that accumulate and are periodically corrected to maintain alignment. These corrections are rarely noticeable as they are designed to preserve continuity rather than disrupt it, yet they introduce subtle discrepancies between the recorded structure of time and the actual progression of events. Blackwood identified such a discrepancy within the station's records, a moment in which the system's internal clock had been adjusted to account for a minor drift that had developed gradually over an extended period. The adjustment itself was small and would not have affected the station's routine in any visible way, but it created a slight misalignment between the expected sequence of events and the framework in which they were recorded. Under normal conditions, this would have had no consequence. However, the pattern that defined the case had already demonstrated a level of precision that made even the smallest inconsistency meaningful. When the day of the adjustment arrived, the station operated according to its usual structure, and the systems that governed it corrected themselves without interruption. From within the environment, nothing appeared to have changed, and the flow of activity remained aligned with expectation. The correction existed within the system, but not within the perception of those who relied on it. Blackwood examined the records not simply to confirm the presence of the transaction, but to determine how it related to the adjusted framework of time. The minute at which the purchase was expected had remained fixed throughout the investigation, appearing with exact precision across years of data without any measurable variation. On that day, the transaction appeared once again in exactly the same recorded position. However, when placed in relation to the corrected timeline, it no longer occupied the same point in the actual sequence of events. The system had shifted slightly in order to maintain alignment with external reference, but the transaction itself had not moved with it. Instead, it remained anchored to the same internal position, unaffected by the adjustment that had influenced every other recorded event. This distinction was subtle, but its implications were significant, because it demonstrated that the pattern did not follow the system's interpretation of time, but instead maintained its own reference, independent of any correction applied to the environment in which it appeared. The station systems adapted in order to preserve consistency, yet the transaction remained unchanged, as though it existed outside of the processes that governed that adaptation. Blackwood recognized that this level of independence could not be explained through any mechanism that operated within the station itself. A system that adjusts its internal clock does so in order to maintain continuity, and all processes within it are expected to align with that correction. The fact that the transaction did not align indicated that it was not bound to that continuity in the same way. It did not adjust because it did not rely on the same structure. This realization brought a new level of clarity to the pattern that had been forming throughout the investigation. The transaction was not simply consistent within the system, but separate from the conditions that defined that consistency. It intersected with the station at a precise moment, yet that moment was not determined by the system's current state, but by a fixed reference that remained unchanged regardless of external adjustment. In effect, the station's time moved around the transaction, rather than the transaction moving within the station's time. By the time Blackwood stepped back from the records, the nature of the anomaly had become more precisely defined than at any previous stage. The pattern was not only independent of the station's operations, but also of its temporal structure, maintaining its position even as the system adjusted itself in order to remain aligned with external reference. This meant that the transaction could not be understood as something that occurred within the same sequence of events as everything else recorded by the station. Instead, it existed in parallel, intersecting with the system at a fixed point that did not shift, did not adapt, and did not respond to changes in the environment. Such behavior suggested that the pattern was not moving forward through time in the conventional sense, but was instead returning to the same position repeatedly, maintaining its alignment with a reference that remained inaccessible to the systems that recorded it. And once that possibility was considered fully, it became increasingly difficult to interpret the pattern as a sequence of events unfolding over years. It began to resemble something else entirely, something that did not progress, did not evolve, and did not move forward, but instead repeated a single moment with absolute precision, intersecting with the visible world only long enough to leave behind a record of its presence before withdrawing again beyond the reach of observation. Within that structure, the repetition was no longer a sign of continuity. It was a sign that the same point in time was being reached again and again, without ever being left behind. By the time the pattern revealed its independence from the station's structure, its systems, and even its sense of time, the investigation had reached a point where the question could no longer be confined to how the anomaly functioned within the visible world. Every attempt to locate its origin within the station had failed, every effort to disrupt its sequence had confirmed its stability, and every layer of analysis had pointed toward the same conclusion that what was being observed did not belong to the environment in which it appeared. It merely intersected with it. This realization led Blackwood to reconsider the nature of the route itself, not as a line between two physical locations, but as something that existed beyond the stations that marked its beginning and end. The departure had no visible origin, the journey left no physical trace, and the arrival produced no confirmation that could be retained. Each stage of the process existed within the system, yet none of them required a presence that could be observed. Taken together, these elements suggested that the route, as it was recorded, might not represent the full extent of what was taking place. It might only represent the parts that could be measured. Blackwood began to examine the route not through its physical coordinates, but through the structure that defined it within the system. Every journey followed the same sequence of data, connecting departure to arrival through a set of recorded points that existed primarily as references rather than locations. These points aligned with real stations, but their function within the system was not dependent on the physical space itself. They were markers, and markers, by their nature, do not require the space they represent to exist in order to function. This distinction introduced a possibility that had not yet been fully considered, that the route did not describe movement through physical space, but through a structure that only appeared to correspond to it. If that were the case, then the stations did not define the journey. They only revealed it. Blackwood followed this line of reasoning with the same measured precision that had guided the investigation from the beginning, allowing each implication to settle before moving forward. If the pattern intersected with the station at a fixed point in time, and if the journey existed without requiring physical presence, then the path between those points could not be understood as a conventional route. It suggested the existence of something else, something that aligned with the system's structure closely enough to be recorded, yet remained independent of the physical world that the system was meant to describe. This idea did not contradict the evidence. It explained it, because it accounted for the absence of origin, the absence of presence, and the absence of completion, while still preserving the integrity of the records. The system recorded a journey because, from its perspective, all required conditions had been met. The departure existed, the transit was confirmed, and the arrival was logged. But those confirmations did not necessarily correspond to physical events. They corresponded to alignment. Blackwood considered what it meant for something to move through a system without occupying the space that system represented. Such movement would not leave behind physical traces, would not require interaction with the environment, and would not produce the kinds of evidence that traditional investigation depends upon. It would exist only at the points where the system recognized it. Everywhere else, it would remain undefined. This brought the investigation to a conclusion that had been forming gradually, becoming clearer with each layer that had been examined. The anomaly was not a person moving through the station, nor was it a process contained within the system. It was something that existed between those definitions, intersecting with both without being fully contained by either. It did not travel in the conventional sense. It aligned. and that alignment occurred at the same point, at the same time, and under the same conditions, regardless of how the surrounding environment changed. By the time Blackwood reached this understanding, the case had moved beyond the possibility of identifying a source within the station or even within the network that connected it. The pattern did not originate there, and it did not depend on those systems to continue. They were simply the places where it became visible. This realization narrowed the focus of the investigation in a way that made the final question unavoidable. If the route did not exist within physical space, and if the journey was defined only by its points of intersection with the system, then what lay between those points could not be mapped, measured, or observed using the tools that had been applied so far. It existed outside of them, not as an absence, but as something that did not require presence to function. And within that structure, the stations themselves took on a different meaning. They were no longer origins or destinations in the conventional sense, but fixed points at which something passed through, leaving behind just enough evidence to confirm that it had been there. Nothing more, nothing less. This led to a final and deeply unsettling implication. The station had never been the place where the journey began, nor had the destination been the place where it ended. They were simply the only places where it could be seen. And if that was true, then the route that connected them was not missing. It had never existed in the way it had been understood, which meant that whatever had been moving through that system for the past 20 years was not traveling between places at all. It was passing through them, from somewhere that had never been recorded to somewhere that had never been found. By the time the investigation reached the point where the route itself could no longer be understood as a physical path, the structure of the pattern had taken on a form that resisted every. The station, the train, the records, and even the passage of time had all been examined and found to be consistent within themselves, yet insufficient to explain the origin of what had been observed. Each layer of analysis had removed another assumption, narrowing the field of possibilities while simultaneously expanding the scope of the question. What remained was not a system to be understood, but a condition to be defined. Blackwood no longer approached the pattern as something that unfolded over days, months, or years. The evidence had already suggested that such a progression did not apply in the conventional sense. The repetition, once interpreted as continuity, had begun to resemble something far more precise, something that did not move forward, but instead returned. Not in memory, not in record, but in structure. He turned his attention away from the accumulation of entries and toward the nature of the moment itself, the fixed point at which the transaction appeared with unwavering consistency. That moment had remained unchanged despite every alteration in the system, every adjustment in time, and every variation in the station's operation. It did not shift. It did not adapt. It did not respond. It simply existed, again and again, in exactly the same position. This level of stability suggested something that could no longer be explained through processes that operated within time as a sequence. A sequence implies progression, change, and variation, even if those changes are minimal. But here, there was none. The moment did not progress. It repeated. Blackwood considered what it meant for a moment to repeat without change, recognizing that such a condition would not produce a series of events in the way the record suggested. Instead, it would produce the appearance of repetition, while in reality, the same point was being reached repeatedly from outside the system that recorded it. From within the station's perspective, this appeared as a continuous pattern extending over years. From outside that perspective, it could represent something entirely different. A single point, accessed multiple times. This interpretation aligned with everything that had been observed. The transaction did not evolve, the timing did not shift, and the structure did not degrade over time. Each instance was indistinguishable from the one before it, not because it was part of a sequence, but because it was the same event intersecting with the system repeatedly. The records did not capture change. They captured recurrence. Blackwood allowed this idea to settle, not forcing it into conclusion, but letting its implications extend naturally across the structure of the case. If the pattern represented the repeated intersection of a single moment with the system, then the concept of duration became irrelevant. The 20 years reflected in the records did not necessarily correspond to 20 years of activity. They represented 20 years of access. This distinction reshaped the investigation in a fundamental way, because it suggested that whatever was responsible for the transaction was not moving through time alongside the station, but accessing a fixed point within it from outside the sequence that defined it. The station experienced that access as repetition, but the pattern itself did not require progression in order to continue. It required only alignment. This understanding brought clarity to details that had previously appeared contradictory. The absence of physical presence, the lack of memory, the stability of the records, and the independence from system adjustments all aligned with the idea that the event was not unfolding within the station's timeline, but intersecting with it. Each day did not produce a new occurrence. It produced the same occurrence again. By the time Blackwood reached this conclusion, the nature of the case had shifted beyond anything that could be addressed through further investigation of the station, the train, or the systems that connected them. The pattern did not originate there, and it could not be resolved within those boundaries. It existed outside them, and yet it remained dependent on a single condition. The moment. That moment, fixed and unchanging, had become the only point at which the pattern could be observed, the only place where it intersected with the world in a way that left behind evidence. Everything else remained inaccessible, existing beyond the reach of observation and beyond the limits of the systems that recorded its presence. Blackwood understood that as long as that moment remained unchanged, the pattern would continue. Not because it was sustained, but because it did not need to end. The investigation had begun with the assumption that something was repeating over time, that a sequence of events was unfolding in a way that defied explanation. What it had revealed instead was something far more precise and far more difficult to confront. There was no sequence. There was only a single point, reached again and again, from somewhere that did not move forward. And that realization led to the final question, one that had been present from the beginning but had not yet been fully understood. If the same moment was being accessed repeatedly, then what existed within that moment, beyond what the system could record, was not simply a transaction. It was something that remained there, unchanged, waiting, and whatever it was, had never needed to arrive. By the time the investigation reached the conclusion that the pattern did not represent a sequence of events, but the repeated intersection of a single fixed moment, the structure of the case had shifted beyond anything that could be approached through conventional logic. The station, the train, the systems, and even time itself had all been examined and gradually removed as sources of explanation, leaving behind something that existed independently of all of them while still appearing within their boundaries. At that stage, the question was no longer how the pattern functioned, but what remained within the moment that defined it. Blackwood returned, once more, to the station, not to observe the pattern as it appeared in the records, nor to examine the systems that had already been proven insufficient, but to consider the physical space in relation to the moment that had become the center of the entire investigation. If the same point in time was being accessed repeatedly, then that point, regardless of how it was perceived, must still exist within the structure of the station. Not as a memory, not as a record, but as a condition. The early hour before the first train arrived had always been defined by its stillness, by the absence of movement and the quiet alignment of everything waiting to begin. It was a moment that belonged neither to the previous day nor to the next, existing as a threshold that connected two states without fully belonging to either. That threshold had been overlooked at first, treated as an empty space between events rather than something with its own structure. Now it became central. Blackwood positioned himself within the station before that moment arrived, allowing the environment to settle into the same quiet configuration that had defined every previous observation. The lights remained steady, the air unmoving, and the absence of activity created a sense of suspension that was subtle, but unmistakable. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing suggested change. And yet, the moment approached. Blackwood did not attempt to measure it through the system, nor did he rely on the recorded time that had already proven unreliable in relation to the pattern. Instead, he observed the environment itself, allowing the transition between stillness and motion to define the boundary he was looking for. There is a point, just before something begins, where the world seems to hold its position for a fraction longer than expected, as though it has not yet committed to the next state. That was the moment. It did not announce itself. It did not differ in any obvious way. But it could be felt. Blackwood remained still within it, not searching for movement, but for presence. At first, there was nothing to distinguish that moment from any other. The station remained unchanged, the silence intact, and the structure of the space held steady as it always had. But as his attention remained fixed, something began to shift, not in the environment itself, but in the way it was perceived. The stillness no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. This change was not immediate, nor was it dramatic. It did not manifest as a visible figure or a movement that could be clearly defined. Instead, it existed as a subtle alteration in the balance of the space, as though something that had not been present before now existed within it, without displacing anything that was already there. Blackwood did not move. He did not attempt to confirm what he was perceiving through action, because action would have required a response, and a response would have implied interaction. What he observed did not suggest interaction. It suggested coexistence. The moment, which had previously appeared empty, now carried a form of presence that could not be localized or measured, yet could not be dismissed. It did not occupy a specific point, nor did it extend across the entire space. It existed within the moment itself, as though it were part of its structure rather than something separate from it. This aligned with everything that had been uncovered. The transaction did not require a person to move through the station, because the presence associated with it did not move in the conventional sense. It existed within the fixed point that intersected with the system, appearing only when that intersection occurred and remaining inaccessible at all other times. Blackwood understood, then, that the investigation had never been about someone arriving at the station. It had been about something that had never left. The name, repeated across years, did not refer to a traveler moving through space, but to a presence that remained anchored within a single moment, intersecting with the system whenever that moment was reached. The records interpreted this as repetition, as a journey that began and ended, but in reality, nothing moved from one point to another. The system recorded movement. The moment contained stillness. And within that stillness, something remained. Blackwood did not attempt to define it further, recognizing that definition would require boundaries, and what he was observing did not appear to have any that could be measured. It was not confined to a shape, nor did it behave like a presence that could be approached or understood through direct observation. It existed as a condition, one that became visible only when the moment aligned with the system that recorded it. As the first signs of movement began to return to the station, as the transition from stillness to activity unfolded once again, the sense of presence diminished, not abruptly, but gradually, as though it were receding beyond the boundary at which it could be perceived. The moment passed. The station resumed its function. And the pattern continued. By the time Blackwood stepped away from that realization, the investigation had reached its final form. There was no individual to identify, no mechanism to disable, and no system to correct. What had been observed could not be removed, because it did not exist within the structures that could be altered. It existed within a moment that returned, again and again, carrying with it something that did not arrive, did not depart, and did not change. And that meant that the case had never been about a man who never arrived. It had been about something that had always been there. There are cases that end with clear answers, and there are those that end with a different kind of clarity, one that does not resolve every question, but allows the structure of what has been observed to exist without contradiction. The difference between these two outcomes is not always obvious, yet it defines whether an investigation reaches a conclusion or simply arrives at a point beyond which further explanation is no longer possible. This case belonged to the latter. By the time Blackwood stepped away from the station for the final time, there was nothing left within its systems, its records, or its physical space that could extend the investigation further. Every layer had been examined with care, and each of them had revealed the same underlying structure, one that did not depend on the station, the train, or even the passage of time in the way such systems are meant to. The pattern had not been solved in the traditional sense, but it had been understood. The name continued to appear within the records with the same quiet precision that had defined it from the beginning, and the transaction remained aligned with a moment that no longer belonged to the system that recorded it. Nothing within the station resisted it, nothing adapted to it, and nothing within the environment suggested that it could be altered or removed. The record did not persist because it was maintained. It persisted because it did not exist within a sequence that could end. Each day, the station moved forward according to its schedule, its systems adjusting as required, its routine unfolding with the same reliability that defined places built on repetition. Passengers arrived and departed, unaware that within the structure of that routine there existed a point that did not move with the rest of it, a moment that returned without changing and without requiring anything beyond its own alignment. Within that moment, the presence remained exactly as it had always been, not as something that entered or left, but as something that existed only when that point was reached. It did not extend beyond it, did not carry itself forward, and did not leave behind anything that could be traced outside the system that briefly recorded its existence. Blackwood did not attempt to interfere with the pattern once its nature had become clear, because any such attempt would have assumed that it belonged to the station in a way that could be influenced. By then, it was evident that the station was not the source of what had been observed, but merely the place where it became visible, a fixed point of intersection between something that remained constant and a world that continued to move around it. The investigation, in the end, did not remove the anomaly. It placed it. It defined the conditions under which it could be understood, even if it could not be explained in terms that would allow it to be resolved. The record remained, not as a trace of something that had happened, but as the only accessible form of something that continued to exist outside the flow of time that the station measured. As long as the system continued to function, as long as the station continued to operate, and as long as that moment remained part of its structure, the pattern would continue to appear with the same precision and the same absence of variation that had defined it for years. It would not change. It would not end. It would simply be reached again. And within that repetition, the meaning of the case no longer depended on finding a person or identifying a cause, but on recognizing that what had been observed was never part of a sequence that could be completed. There had been no traveler moving through the station, no arrival that had been missed, and no departure that had taken place in the way it had first appeared. There had only been a moment, a fixed point within the structure of the system, intersecting with it again and again, leaving behind a record each time, while remaining entirely unchanged beyond it. And within that moment, something remained, not waiting in the sense that implies expectation, but existing in a state that required no progression and no resolution, returning only when the conditions aligned in exactly the same way as before. If this case held your attention, if its quiet pattern and steady sense of unease stayed with you longer than expected, then you are already part of what makes these investigations worth following. You can subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments, not because it will resolve what has been found, but because there are always more cases like this one, and each of them begins in the same way with something small, something easily overlooked, and something that does not quite fit. And somewhere, within another system, another record may already exist, waiting to be noticed, repeating in its own way, and following a structure that has yet to be understood.